Hello and welcome to my painting corner and to the monthly update of the opinion polls conducted in Russia by the Levada Center. I will touch also on the main news that are making the headlines in Russia. First, the Israeli-Hamas war, and a distant second, the new sanctions that are being imposed on Russia by the US and the EU. The monthly opinion poll results show that support for Mr. Putin remains high, and the respondents are quite supportive of how the country is being governed. The Levada Center has conducted also a survey focusing on the economic sanctions, and on the whole, the respondents are not particularly worried about them. And the Kremlin has dismissed the latest round of sanctions as futile and pointed out that they harm Europe more than they harm Russia. But it is the Israeli-Hamas war that is making the front page. With regards to the current conflict, Mr. Putin said that the only way to achieve stability in the region is by implementing the two-state solution. For a bit of historical context, there were well-established Jewish communities in the region, but since the middle of the 1800s, the flow of Jewish immigrants began increasing as Jews fled persecution in Europe and Russia, and accelerated in the 1900s. The local Arab population became increasingly concerned with the flood of refugees, and tension over the land and water rights increased, resulting in clashes between the two. One of the things that the arriving Jews brought with them was an idea that was doing the rounds in Europe, i.e. nationalism. And yes, at least in Europe, we are still going around putting out the fires that little idea started. Nationalism is catchy, and in the early 1900s, the idea of a state for both Palestinians and Jews emerges. Promises are made to the Arab populations and then broken, in part due to a few issues. Britain, who had taken over control of the regions from the Ottoman Empire, was grappling with a few issues of her own, namely two world wars, the threat of famine in Europe, and economic Armageddon. At the end of the Second World War, Britain refers the Jewish-Palestinian question or situation to the newly formed UN. And in 1947, the UN General Assembly adopts Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The Arab representatives deemed the allocation of territory unfair and rejected it. The Jewish representatives didn't like it much either, but they saw it as a necessary step towards establishing the State of Israel, and they accepted it. Tensions built up and erupted in the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948-49, and the UN begins mediating. It issues Resolution 194 and moves to facilitate a lasting peace process in the region. Since then, not to trivialize the horrors of close to 100 years of fighting and various degrees of viciousness, but it is a case of play, pause, and rewind, and go again. Here I focus on the view from Moscow, but I would encourage you to go into a bit more depth, and I have listed three main sources of information on the history of Israel and Palestine. One is British, one is Jewish, one is Palestinian. Yes, you need to compare all three and more if you have the time to reach a somewhat balanced understanding of the situation. Jumping back to the present, Moscow supports a partitioning along the lines of the 1967 borders, UN Resolution 242 and 338. However, partitioning a piece of land where people live looks easy only when you're looking at a map. Now we need to touch on the so-called international meddling. Mr. Putin has pointed the finger to the United States' reckless policies in the regions as root cause of the conflict. The accusation that the United States has been active in the region for a long time is not wrong, but so has the USSR and then the Russian Federation. In the 1940s, the Soviet Union supported the idea of a Jewish state, and the calculation was that the formation of a Jewish state would anger the Arab population and undermine British influence in the region. In the war of 1948, the USSR supported Israel, but in the early 50s it switched to supply military equipment and training to Egypt and Syria and later Lebanon. Some of the Arab nations welcomed the Soviet interest in the region as a way to counterbalance the influence of the United States and the ex-colonial powers, namely France and Britain. Hostilities between Israel and Palestinians continues, and about 4 wars later, the October War of 1973 happened. And the two superpowers, i.e. the United States and the Soviet Union, had to start talking in order to stop the whole thing from going nuclear. Back to the present, Mr. Lavrov has repeatedly warned that the current conflict has the potential to escalate and spread. And if we look at past conflicts in the region, we can come up with a what-if scenario for escalation. Fighting in Gaza continues and spreads to the West Bank. The Hezbollah in Lebanon join in. The Israeli army fights in Lebanon, goes through it, and heads for Damascus in Syria. From the Russian point of view, the force behind the Israeli is the United States. Therefore, the move east is perceived as a threat to Moscow and to its allies in the region, namely Iran and Syria. So the Russians respond by increasing military and non-military aid to both countries, put some boots on the ground in the form of paramilitary organizations. Iraq is drawn into the conflict and probably will split among groups supporting Iranian-sponsored organizations such as Hezbollah, groups who would rather side with the Americans but cannot ideologically support Israel, and groups that resent Iranian influence in the country, and the situation may evolve into civil war. On the other side, Egypt and Jordan are morally obliged to support Palestinians, but are worried about the sudden influx of refugees, which may result in tensions between the existing population and the new arrivals. Taking the example of Egypt, the influx of Palestinians may help in reviving political Islam in the country, which could pose a challenge to the status quo. In 2012, Mr. Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist Party was elected president of Egypt. He was removed by the army in 2013, and Mr. al-Sisi took over and was elected president in 2014. Mr. Morsi died in prison in 2019. In short, neither Egypt or Jordan may be too keen to go army to army with Israel, but the situation may escalate to a point which they may feel that they have to. The relationship between Egypt and Hamas is an interesting one. Hamas originally was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Mr. al-Sisi government has openly negative views of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas at home. However, Egypt has helped Hamas with reconstruction projects in the Gaza Strip and provided aid, and Egypt and Hamas have fought together against IS, so you could say that they are best of frenemies. In Russia, like in the US and Europe, the focus of public opinion and politicians has moved from the war in Ukraine to the Hamas-Israeli war for a number of reasons. The Ukrainian counter-offensive is taking its toll, and progress is slow on both sides. And the gravity of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Gaza is small and the borders are closed, so there are few safe areas to evacuate civilians to, and Hamas has asked the population to stay put. In addition, there are no bomb shelters in Gaza. Yes, there are the Hamas tunnels, but those are for military purposes only. And of course, should the situation escalate, the threat of a repeat of the 1973 oil crisis. For example, OPEC may declare an oil embargo, and as a result, energy prices, which are already high because of the sanctions on Russia, would skyrocket. In addition, fighting may spread and affect access to the Suez Canal, which would disrupt global supply chains. Both scenarios are bad for Russia, in my opinion. The Suez Canal is a key trading route for Russia, and another jump in energy costs may result in political and social instability in Europe. Russia needs Europe to be stable, as much as Europe needs Russia to be politically stable. The war in the Middle East is causing a few headaches at home too. Moscow's relationship with Turkey's President Mr. Erdogan seemed to have cooled somewhat after the accession of Sweden to NATO, and probably has not been improved by the rousing pro-Palestinian speech Mr. Erdogan gave on October the 29th, which coincidentally was followed by angry crowds storming the main international airport in Dagestan as a plane arrived from Israel. But according to the Kremlin, this manifestation of sectarianism is not homegrown. The Kremlin has absolutely zero tolerance for any form of sectarianism, as it is perceived as an existential threat in Russia. The Kremlin has stated that the people that stormed the airport are the victims of a misinformation campaign orchestrated by Ukraine with the help of the United States, and it's just another example of an attempt to harm and divide Russia. Thank you so much for staying with me till the end. The topic is complex, and I have hardly scratched the surface. Thank you so much for watching. My next video will be Chapter 6 of The Golden Knot, which is a work of fantasy. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.